The World Bank released the 2011 Gender Equality and Development Report. It's out today. For details now, we're joined by Devarajan, who's Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. Thanks so much for being with us, Shanta. Generally, the circumstances for women worldwide have improved, but it doesn't seem to be the case for Africa. Why is that? But also talk us through the improvements that we're generally seeing, the trends internationally.
Well, I think, as the report says, the glass is both half full and half empty. Yeah. We've seen major strides in women's access, for instance, to education in most parts of the world, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa and maybe South Asia. Women are enrolling in primary school, secondary school, and in tertiary schools in developing countries. In tertiary education, there are more women than men enrolled today. That is looking favorable. At the same time, there's something like 35 billion out-of-school girls around the world. And the other thing that concerns us quite a bit is that the learning outcomes for girls is not as high as it should be. Girls are missing days of school for absenteeism, and then they drop out of school. We just had a seminar today where we're hearing about the problem with secondary school children in South Africa with the sugar daddies and all of that problems. Yeah. So there's a long way to go.
Okay, well, those social problems withstanding, why is Africa lagging? Because we've seen so much being said by African leaders about committing to the timetable of the Millennium Development Goals, of which so many of those components support the idea of gender emancipation.
Well, I think one of the major areas is health. What we're seeing, there's this phenomenon called the missing women, and this was considered a feature of India and China and places like that. Now we find that the missing women are in Africa, particularly in West Africa and Southern Africa to some extent. Now, some of that has to do with HIV/AIDS. I mean, HIV/AIDS has a triple whammy for women, because it's not only if they get the disease, but they might pass it on to their children, and then they have to care for a spouse or a family member with HIV. And that has led to increases in maternal mortality rates, including in this country, in South Africa. So the health situation for women is actually quite serious. We've also seen a disturbing trend in gender-based violence. Now, some people think that maybe just because we're either measuring it more accurately, and also women's voice is now raised enough that they are talking about it. But it's certainly a very discouraging trend.
Mortality is something that the report really focuses on and lays emphasis on, and we're told that, despite all the breakthroughs in education and medicine, more women are still dying as opposed to men. Is it just a function of HIV or other issues as well?
Just to be clear, it's more women who are dying relative to men, relative to their counterparts in developed countries. So if these women lived in Japan or the US, they'd be less likely to die. And so we see it's a combination of factors. I think HIV/AIDS has certainly got a lot to do with it. But there are other factors as well, just things like safe water and sanitation is contributing to the death of infants and young children in large quantities.
The economic opportunities that exist for women, we're told that post-credit crisis, women now constitute a key function of the consumer class internationally, that because of the decisions that they make in retail, because of their earnings, women could contribute something like $5 trillion to the global economy in the next 10 years. As we see this rise of a consumer class, where are the African women?
Yes. That's true worldwide, for sure. But in Africa, even though there's been an increase in women's participation in the labor force, including in South Africa, what we observe is that most women are engaged in agriculture in low-income Africa. They're engaged in small plots of land and are basically subsistence farmers. And there's been lots of problems of getting those small plots of land or even small household enterprises to grow, to become larger household enterprises, because women lack access to finance. And another big important factor is access to title. Sometimes women may have, in the letter of the law, access to title, but in the practice, there are other factors that intervene, and they don't actually own their land.
What do you make of a phenomenon where we know women constitute the majority of the population? In the formal economy, they contribute 40% certainly in South Africa, 80% in the informal economy, but they're not represented in terms of decisions in the mainstream. South Africa and even the United States, these developed economies fare very badly when we start talking about women who run JSE or listed companies, women's representation in the boardroom. Why is that?
Yeah, this is also a difficult factor, because I think it's partly to do with the fact that it's a vicious cycle. When you don't see women as chairman of the board or as CEOs of companies, then people are less likely to think of appointing them as CEOs and chairman of the company. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This may be one area where we should, even though we're often reluctant to do so, we should be thinking about quotas. If you get a few women out there in the lead, then you begin to think it's normal to have women as CEOs and as chairman of the board.
Policy suggestions, now that we're seeing this report and we know that it's not a stellar performance on the part of Africa?
Several, I would say. Coming back to the health point, when we can determine that the main ingredient for survival of young girls is health, is water and sanitation, we should be focusing on that. I mean, I think there's been a misallocation to just health expenditures without water and sanitation. Similarly, with schools, if we can improve teacher absenteeism, so that teachers are there, then parents are more likely to keep sending their children to school, and they're more likely to learn. And land title, very important, and also access to finance. I mean, I understand that in South Africa, some women who are living in the squatter settlements don't have residence permits, so they can't get a bank account. Well, I think we should be thinking about mobile banking. In Kenya, they all have bank accounts, even though many of them don't have residences.
All right, thanks so much for your insights. The views there of Devarajan, who's the Chief Economist for Africa region at the World Bank, just joining us to talk about the gender report that was released earlier on today.